Welcome to Integrity Talks, where we explore ethical leadership, responsible business, and sustainability. Joining us in this episode of the Integrity Talks podcast is BP, one of Southern Africa's leading integrated energy companies with over a century of presence on the continent. Known for its trusted service stations, award-winning fuels, and convenience brands, BP continues to deliver a superior customer experience while upholding strong ethical values. Driven by their purpose and core principles, live our purpose, play to win, and care for others, BP is committed to fostering respectful partnerships and responsible business practices. We're honored to have them share their insights on ethics and compliance in today's business environment.
Welcome to Integrity Talks, where we dive into ethics in action, where we look at how business strengthens its role beyond compliance. Today, I'm joined by Vusani Garini, a seasoned professional in the procurement space. He has over 20 years in supply chain and procurement management. So let me allow him to introduce himself. Vusani, welcome.
As you have mentioned, I've been in procurement for many years, over 20 years. Across many different industries, oil and gas, construction, and logistics. I currently serve as the Senior Manager for Procurement at BP, looking after South Africa as well as global aviation. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. It's overwhelming. That's quite an impressive portfolio. And I look forward to the information you'll share with us with all the years of experience you've indicated. Maybe let's start off with explaining, what does a procurement professional do? What does that entail?
Yeah, so we simplistically, I know everybody says they can be a procurement person because they buy groceries and stuff at home, but essentially we try and get goods and services for the organizations that we work for. That entails a whole lot of activity behind it through the strategies of how these goods and services need to be procured, making sure that there is a resilient supply chain and it doesn't impact our business operations and so on. And this is done with multiple stakeholders, whether it is the third parties that we deal with, as well as internal stakeholders, also other stakeholders that could be maybe regulatory and entities like that.
Yeah.
So in essence, the simplistic answer is we procure goods and services for the entities that we work for. Yeah.
And so the buying and selling happens at different levels, private sector, with the government, and also across different sizes of business. So from SMMEs to large corporates and so forth. So I think touching on today's topic, ethics in action, and really understanding the role of ethics becomes that much more important, because this really then becomes a cornerstone of how business is carried out, and how society functions, and how we deliver on some of those promises. Why would ethics be important in your space, just as a general outlook? Why, and what role does it play?
Yeah, so ethics is simply good business, right? So because without ethics in the supply chain, a lot of things can seriously go wrong, from cost of non-compliance, because you do run those risks of non-compliance, and you fall foul of authorities, but also if you speak specifically in ethics around bribery and corruption and things like that, those come with a cost, a financial cost to the organizations, because typically if somebody needs to pay bribes and things like that, they're going to inflate costs to cover those envelopes they're trying to give people. But ethics is broader than just what we in BP call ABC, anti-bribery and corruption, because there's also other stuff. Are you complying with health and safety? These days there's issues around labor rights and modern slavery, sustainability issues, and I've mentioned earlier about financial crimes, and so on. So if you don't, there is a cost to non-compliance. There is a cost to reputations. There is a financial cost to the supply chain itself. Yeah.
So ethics really talks to that, the cost of how business is run, the value that business brings to both society and its stakeholders, and more so the power of sustainability in ensuring that we bring forward sustainable practices and uphold sustainable businesses. How does this translate into your supply chain, for example, especially where SMEs are coming in? What are some of the dynamics that you've dealt with where SMEs are coming into your supply chain and have to adhere to ethical practices?
Yeah, so they have to adhere to the policies that we've got, right? So we have what we call supplier expectations, which are part of the BP Code of Conduct, right? Partly because if they don't have ethical practices, they will be impacting our own code of conduct on our side. But at the same time, I'm not oblivious to the fact that SMMEs and big corporates, whatever, are subsets of a society that we live in, right? There is specifically in South Africa a lot of mistrust of the system because of a lot of the corruption that is happening. And it's not corruption only in the state entities, it's corruption in the private sector as well. So that in itself, we always try through the onboarding processes and whatever of SMMEs and big corporates, by the way. So we also do business with other big entities as well. That we need to enforce particular ethical or measures that ensure, go a long way in ensuring that we don't have ethical risks that exist, whether it's conflicts of interest, whether it is, like I mentioned earlier, bribery and corruption, etc.
Yeah. I think we can definitely all agree that business doesn't operate in isolation, and secondly, can't operate in a broken state, in a broken society. So it's important that we have that collaboration and have that collective approach to the different roles that the different stakeholders play in upholding and really staying true to ethics and the impact that it has on sustainable business practices. So, Vusani, let's dive a little deeper into the dynamics of the relationship between corporates and SMEs. There's possible misconceptions, there's possible assumptions between those two stakeholders. What would you say, from your experience, really is the dynamic between corporates and SMEs when it comes to procurement and ethical practices?
Yeah, so in its nature, it's a meeting of not equals, right? Which means there is always an assumption that the corporate is putting a lot of red tape to then put a barrier in terms of for the SMMEs to be able to be part of the supply chain.
Correct.
Right? Whereas the corporate is trying to mitigate risks that over many years have been probably seen and then ultimately mitigated, and we've got to continue mitigating them, right? So one of the biggest ones is the corporate will always assume that it's not actually an assumption. A lot of the SMMEs probably do not have safeguards or policies or mitigations against ethical issues within their own processes, right? And the corporate always wants to insist on them having those in place.
Yeah.
That could come with a cost, because there's a cost to audit, there's a cost to putting policies in place. You probably need to get consultants to come and help you, whether it's in the HR space, whether it is in ethics and compliance stuff that are regulatory, that some of the SMMEs probably don't even know about, but they should know about. So there is if you come supply into the oil and gas industry, there's parts that are, there's compliances that are related to some of the technical, like if you're going to work on some of our equipment, there is accreditations that you've got to have, HSSE accreditation. If it's financial, you've got to be meeting all the financial bodies and all of that stuff. So there is a cost. So SMMEs sometimes tend to see that as a barrier to entry into the supply chains. Of course, there's ways to help them. So once they're in your supply chain, or once they come in, there are programs that we do run through, whether it's ESD or things like that, to get them up to speed. But in essence, from a BP point of view, like I mentioned earlier, there is a supply expectations. So as part of all of that, policies are given to them. They are free to go and replicate them within their own organizations instead of trying to start from scratch, because what's important is we need to make sure that we're on the same page right from the beginning.
And I think that's really important. Definitely, it would be overwhelming for an SME to come one into that industry. And there is a definite misconception of all the rules that are put in place and what they're intended to do. And also, I think SMEs, from some of the research that we've done as the Ethical Supplier project, is understanding what are those limitations that SMEs actually experience. And some of it basically just at compliance level would be the capacity or the resources to meet compliance, to be able to adhere to standards, comply with those standards, and upkeep with annual checks and such. You mentioned auditing, for example. So those costs associated with general compliance requirements and standards can come across as quite hefty for SMEs. So I think it's, you mentioned that you have these supplier development programs. Can you shed a bit of light in terms of those supplier development programs run at BP? What are some of the achievements that you can perhaps share, or lessons learned that have come out of that you can share?
Not in particular around ethics, right?
No, no.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, we've been running an ESD program for many years, right? So and across the different industries, and well, the suppliers have come from different industries and so on. So yeah, so we most recently, so I think one of the issues with ESD is that in their nature, or maybe that's another misconception that people have, it's an SMME, therefore that person doesn't know how to run a business. Generally, you find that it's ex-corporate people who have gone and done MBAs and done whatever, or business management, whatever it is, that come and set up these companies. We then make an assumption that they don't know marketing, they don't know how to run their books, they don't know, and then you put them in a cookie cutter classroom setup. They don't need the same, they don't have the same needs. So what we do is we've got partners that we've designed an ESD program. Maybe let me put it as a SD program, Supplier Development Program, where each entity that participates in that program has gone through a process of a needs assessment. So what does this particular entity need for them to, because some just need money, some need ISO certification, some actually don't know marketing, some actually don't know another aspect of a business, and then tag them to mentors over I think it's a minimum of a year, and that mentor will go through them in terms of the challenges or the gaps that they've got. Now, if there are gaps around controls in their businesses, that's where it comes up. They need to develop policies, that's where it would come up, and so on. But, successes, I mean, there's an entity which today probably runs, when we started with them, they do fuel transport, as an example. Assisted them a couple of years ago to buy a few tankers and trucks. And today they're probably going towards close to 100 tankers with business across. They're not dependent on a BP. They're supplying everybody in the industry, which is something we're proud of. There are entities we have in our business that never existed, but now they go and be very big maintenance related service providers for fuel systems, because it's a specialist area. We've got environmental consultants that we've helped. So there is quite a number of success stories. There's of course also failures for different reasons. So we're not going to say that no failures. But to the topic in terms of ethics and stuff like that, I think the base point of where we come from is there is a supplier expectations, which is, and these are one of the things that you always need to do is for instance, we've got something called contractor forums that happen every quarter. And in each one of those, there is a slot around ENC, ethics and compliance and stuff like that, because you've got to keep reinforcing a lot of these messages. You know, how do you deal with what do you call it, like gifts and entertainment? You know, so in procurement where I work, I don't take a pen.
Oh man, I was about to give you one.
So now I can't even go to France for rugby, you know, that stuff like that, because it can be perceived. Some people use that type of stuff to then try and influence sourcing decisions. That is also problematic, you know, if I were to tell you. So how do you then build? So others will argue, how do you build strategic relationships with whatever if there is no,
with your stakeholders,
at least entertainment or whatever it is? But you can. It doesn't need to be in France to talk about innovation.
Yeah, and I think that's a very critical point also for SMEs to understand that where there are challenges, one, whether it's operational challenges or structural issues that they have, that there are actual solutions and programs in place to help them structure that. So I think one really would appreciate how BP has taken that approach, that your supply development programs are not a cookie cutter approach, and they then specified to an SME's needs. And I think also in addition to areas that are a bit blurry, you know, taking into consideration the South African context, a number of phrases come through like Ubuntu. But this is Ubuntu, right? So if I'm extending a hand and the other service provider is assisting me, we work together to achieve a particular goal. So I can imagine that those gray areas and those societal norms and behaviors have a negative impact or a challenge that they present. How do you deal with those, or how has BP dealt with those challenges where it is perhaps a gray area based on an SME's assumption or exposure and societal norms and standards to have coffee?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with having coffee, right? It's what comes out of the coffee that is wrong. You know, so I'm not saying you can't have coffee. I mean, we meet many suppliers, many SMMEs and so on. So part of our gifts and entertainment policy, as an example, has got guidelines around what you can do, what you cannot do. You know, so for instance, one of the practices is, so generally I ask people to come to the office if you want to have a meeting, but if there is to be coffee that needs to be had, you've got to do all the declarations every time. Sometimes if it's more than one meeting, we pay for the next meeting, as an example. You know, so, but we don't do these meetings mid-tender, you know, so you do not meet any suppliers or participants in tenders during tenders. So that's, I don't think I need to explain why, because, you know, you can't influence. You know, so it doesn't mean it will stop. It's a mitigation that is 100% foolproof, as an example. It is not, because like I said earlier on, we live within a society, and the society there is a lot of bribery and corruption. We have had instances of situations where we've had to either dismiss people, or it's criminal cases, or there's investigations and things like that, because I cannot, on the policy, or anybody cannot police what people do beyond particular, like our premises, because people can go do stuff, and it becomes more sophisticated these days in terms of how payments are done, so you wouldn't be able to. So there are those failures, but I think once we're transparent about the sourcing opportunities that are available, we're transparent around how we select service providers that come in, and then be able to put guardrails around when stuff goes wrong, what do you do? You know, so we also have we call it open talk. You know, it's a complaints management process that we have, run by one of the auditing firms. So any complaint that gets lodged there gets investigated, and there will be business intelligence teams that go and look on those complaints, and then come back whether it's substantiated or not. You know, so
So, Vusani, earlier on, you mentioned that BP has a number of development programs that focus on assisting SMEs within your supply chain, helping them address where there are gaps and how they can better position themselves and participate really in supply chain practices. What are some of the barriers and challenges that SMEs have to face with the upkeep of high standards, for example, ISO standards, and just the complexities of keeping up with ethical requirements?
Yeah, so some of that compliance, of course, is very expensive. So you mentioned ISO. Some of the quality management systems that need to be these SMMEs need to comply to and constantly get it recertified or kept up to date can be very expensive, right? It's also, when they don't have them, it's a barrier when they need to go participate in other more stringent supply chains. Because I do know, for instance, ESCOM says ISO. For you to go participate with ESCOM, you need to do that. So, like I mentioned earlier, in our SD program, so if an entity is in a space which requires them to do that type of compliance, and the needs assessment has picked it up, and the mentors, the motivate, all of that stuff, we avail resources to get them either certified, if it's still within the program, or re-certify if it's a continuation. So it's very important for SMMEs to comply, because these things are a barrier. Complying even to BP standards is expensive, right? So if you are a contractor that works on our sites, there's HSSE compliance. It expires every year. Yeah. Every year when it expires, you need to put a bit of resources to gain it. Not to pay to BP, but for you to have your safety system verified and audited, and so on. You've got to, at the outset, how do you hire people? So you need to mitigate. One of the things that we test under labor rights and modern slavery is, are you employing minors, or are you employing illegal foreigners? Yeah. So how do we meet? So there's police clearances and making sure that your own processes as an SMME and your own systems detect that this person has got illegal papers, and things like that. So we do try. Some of it is not through the supply development program, but in the normal course of business, because there is ongoing auditing of the entities that we partner with. And when it's picked up, they've got to correct it. And then if there's any assistance from some of our technical experts, that also happens. Yeah.
Let's double click on that a bit, right? We're talking about auditing and finding out where the gaps are in the supply chain and in that space. Are there examples or a example that you can share, doesn't have to be specific to BP, industry-wide, where ethics really have been compromised, and how that had an impact on either that particular SME or other stakeholders that were involved?
Yeah, so without mentioning names. So they've always, like I said, I try to repeat the statement that we don't operate outside of the society we live in. So we've also had instances of bribery and corruption, as an example. Sourcing processes that have gone wrong, in a sense that when you then finally get to the bottom, when we finally got to the bottom of the issue, we had lost a lot of money, in the millions of rands.
Yeah.
So you've got to, what does that do? So there's the financial loss that we incur. But there is also a reputational thing, because other SMMEs or suppliers that were probably interested in that business, they probably know, because it's also a small community, that no, you can't participate with this company because it's already set. So there's no point, So even if you go to the market, nobody responds because they know it's already a compromised activity. It led to people having to leave the organization, cases being opened, but unfortunately also SSMEs getting dismissed off our supply chain, and they will never come back, because our counterparty due diligence process will always pick it up that there was there was an issue.
Yeah.
I
mean, the impact is clearly detrimental, not just on the SME themselves, but as you mentioned, reputationally for yourselves, I think for society at large. And earlier we mentioned that the whole point of ethics as well is rebuilding that trust between business and society and various stakeholders that are involved. And for us to proceed in a meaningful and sustainable manner, trust is critical. Would you have some key points that you can share with SMEs or some of our listeners around how to really improve or ensure that they upkeep compliance and not just for ticking a box, but really the importance of ethical practices and decision making?
Yeah, so at the bare minimum, they've got to meet the regulations. Right? So whatever is the regulation and the country laws and whatever it is, that's a non-negotiable because you've got to meet. You can't hire 13-year-olds to come do work. So that's the first part. The second part is a lot of this have got to do with individuals themselves, right? So I think you've got to determine your own ethical standing before it gets tested.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's where this stuff, because you've got to be, so one of the issues with procurement is you're dealing with a lot of money, right? It's money you'll never earn in your life.
Yeah.
So if your ethical standing and whatever is compromised, you will want a share of that money and compromise the corporate, compromise the supplier and everybody. So, and that's where it starts to fall apart. But systematically, I think whether it's a big organization or the SMME, you've got to put processes and systems around how you manage these things, because they will happen, and everybody's trying to take a shortcut somewhere, right? So the processes and systems need to be there. And then I think the last part is for you to gain the credibility is when there are issues that get reported, you act on them.
Okay.
And the process around that complaints management process is actually robust, that people can trust that something will happen if they raise an issue. And then broadly, which is more beyond, it's not just SMME corporate. I think broadly let's use the South African context. I think we've got to, I suspect there's a capability that is not there, which is the auditing part of this thing. I think needs to have more supply chain knowledge, because if you do not understand how the supply chain works, how procurement works, and how people can take shortcuts, you can do an investigation and whatever answer somebody, then you come out clean. And that's, I think it tends to play out even in the media when you see some of the cases that go nowhere. So that capability needs to be enhanced, whether it's in private sector or public sector. But for the SMMEs, I think they have to take it seriously. It's not a tick box exercise. It is good business for them to do it, because it's not to the detriment of the corporate, it's the detriment of themselves. One day they will grow and have these gaps. So now if they haven't really put mitigations in place, they're in for some trouble. And
I think a definite an important pointer, because we are talking to SMEs that want to find themselves in a space where they progress within the supply chain, where they get increased opportunity, and more so you want a market space that provides you with that opportunity. You want a market space that provides you with continuous security as well, that work will proceed, but that can't be done in isolation. So it's not BP's responsibility alone. It means it's also the SME's responsibility to step up and to uphold ethical practices, but it's also the individual leader's responsibility to act in an ethical manner, to lead in an ethical manner, and make ethical decisions and choices that would be long-lasting. So I think thank you so much for sharing those. I think those are really key points and key learnings, not just for SMEs, like we mentioned, for private and public sector as well. Fusani, thank you again for sharing what you've shared, for bringing valuable insight from a professional with over 20 years experience. And I think the insights that you've shared have really been valuable. Do you have any parting words that you can share with predominantly our SME viewers in terms of how they can really align themselves and take up the call to operating and running their businesses in an ethical manner?
Thanks, Zoe, for having me. I think it is a good initiative that you guys are doing. For the SMMEs, I think the first thing is let's first all as individuals take our own ethical standing before it is tested. Secondly, get all your processes and procedures in place to be able to handle these things, because there is help and material and available from all the corporates like BP and everybody else. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. So once we all do that, I think we will go a long way as a country.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining Integrity Talks. Stay tuned as we continue to champion ethical leadership, responsible business, and sustainability. Visit nbi.com/integritytalks.org.za to explore, gain insights, and be part of the conversation.